Today I'm making art inspired by apples, and I'll be using watercolor paints, and I'm also making my mom's apple pie recipe. So I start out by drawing an 8x10 border because that's how big I want the painting to be, and then I mark out the center and a couple other structural markers so that the scale is accurate. And then I take a regular pencil and I draw an outline of the whole painting. And I do this first in pencil just because there's not really any erasing with paint, and I want to make sure that I get all of the proportions right. And it looks kind of like a weird apple, but you'll see what it is later on. Then once the sketch is done, I erase the whole thing so the markings are really light because I don't want the pencil showing through the paint. I'm starting with the crust, and for that you'll need 2.5 cups of flour, a half teaspoon of salt, a cup of chilled vegetable shortening, and some ice water. Now I mix the first color starting with cadmium yellow medium and yellow green, and then I add yellow ochre and some more cadmium yellow medium and some cadmium lemon. And then I make a couple more watered down and lighter shades of the color that I just made. Then I take the lightest shade and fill in the lightest sections of the apple flesh on the body of the apple. And then I take the next darkest shade and do parts of the flesh that are in shadow. And I shouldn't really say darkest because it's really more saturated than darker. I'll be using a neutral tint to darken stuff later. Then I mix yellow green with the most saturated shade of yellow to make it a yellowish green, not quite ripe color. And I use that on the little spot near the stem of the apple, and then also down below on the peel that came from up there. Then I take the light yellow and I fill in the little parts of flesh that are connected to the peel. Now to mix the crust, I add the flour and salt to a big bowl and whisk it together. Then I have a KitchenAid mixer, so I use that with the dough hook attached, but you're actually supposed to use a pastry blender. So then I cut in the shortening and make sure it's been chilled, and I add it bit by bit until it's coarse and crumbly. And I add ice water 1 tablespoon at a time. I used 5 tablespoons, but I probably should have used 6 because my dough was a little bit dry. Then I separate it out into 2 balls and wrap them in saran wrap and put them in the fridge for at least a half hour. Now I mix the background using blue, cobalt, ultramarine, and violet to make a purplish blue hue. And then I make a couple watered down versions of that. Then I use the lightest of the shades for the lightest part of the background, which is here at the top. Then I use the slightly darker shades for the darker parts of the background, which is in the shadows and in the foreground because the light source is coming from behind the apple. Now I make the filling for the pie, which is a cup of sugar, 3 tablespoons cornstarch, a teaspoon cinnamon, a 1/4 teaspoon ginger, an 1/8 teaspoon nutmeg, and 9 apples. I've got 4 Honey Crisps, 3 Pink Ladies, and 2 Granny Smiths. Next I make pink starting with scarlet, then adding carmine and more water so it's light. And I use this on the parts of the peel that are getting hit with light, the highlights. And the peel curves around, so some parts are bathed in light while others are in shadow, but I'm just doing the highlights now and I'll do the shadows later. Then I take a little bit of the yellow green from before and add cadmium yellow medium to it to make a richer golden shade of yellow that I use on the parts of the peel that have some yellow streaks in it. And then I use it up at the spot by the stem too. Then I peel the apples, and this is what I'm basing the painting on right here. I changed the background and added a stem though. Then I cut it up, starting by cutting it in half, then quarters, then eighths, and then cutting out the core, and then cutting that in half to make small wedges so that each apple makes 16 pieces total. And then I repeat that with the rest of the apples, peeling them and cutting them until they're all done and I have a big bowl of apple pieces. Now I make the red for the peel using scarlet and carmine and cadmium lemon and cadmium yellow medium to orange it up a little bit. Then I start at the top of the peeled off peel and I work my way down, avoiding the highlighted parts that I did before. Then further down I layer over parts of the yellow because there's some orangish parts of the peel by the yellow streaks. And I leave just a little bit of yellow untouched and fill out the rest of the peel, avoiding the pink and yellow green parts. And then I fill in some red up by the stem. Then I use a big brush to fill out the peel and switch to a medium brush to get the more detailed spots. Watercolor is nice because the paint is so thin and the brushes are so delicate that you can get really detailed, like here with this little brush in this little space. Then I add the sugar to the apples and the cornstarch and the cinnamon and ginger and nutmeg, and then I leave it to sit for a few hours. Now I'm going to make a light brown, starting with red ochre, then adding burnt sienna and burnt umber and mixing that up and adding some Mars brown and mix that up till I have the color that I want. Then I use that to fill in that kind of raw area around the stem. Then I mix a darker brown by adding more burnt umber and I use that to create the stem. Then I go back and do another layer of the light yellow of the flesh of the apple. And I always like my first round of colors to be light while I get the placement right. And then I get into the richer colors once I've laid it out with the light colors. And this is just to minimize mistakes because it's really hard to try to erase watercolors. Then I switch to the golden yellow to do another layer of the yellow streaks on the peel. And then I use the pink to go over those highlighted areas again. 3 hours later, the apples are ready and it's time to roll out the crust, which I do on some wax paper, and I go really slowly so I don't break it. Then I place a pie pan on top of the crust, flip it over, and carefully peel off the wax paper. Then I patch it up a bit and then roll out the second crust carefully like I did the first. Then I do another layer of the background using the same color as before. And it's really important when using watercolors to let the paint dry in between colors. It doesn't take long, and if you don't, the colors will bleed into each other, which is really hard to fix. Next, I dump the apples and their juices into the crust, and then I use a rolling pin to flip over the other crust, and then I smush the edges together with my fingers. Now I'm doing another round of the red for the peel using scarlet and some cadmium orange this time to make it really vibrant. Then I start at the top and work my way down again so that my hand isn't close to anything I just painted to accidentally mess it up. And I get a little more detailed with this layer, working around those highlighted areas, making little markings so they feel like spots with light hitting them, not just random pink splotches. Then when I get down to the yellow streaks, I use up almost all the paint on the brush so it's really dry. Then I make vertical lines with that dry brush so the paint breaks up a bit and the yellow feels more like an organic splash of color on the red peel. Then I let some of the previous red color show near the highlighted areas. That's my favorite part of watercolor paintings, those places where multiple layers converge that look so delicate. Then I go and do the peel on the main body of the apple using a wet brush in some parts, then a dry brush in some parts, and then layering it together to create some interesting texture. Then I fill in the little folded under part of the peel here, and then the red up top by the stem. Then I do a layer of light brown on the stem itself. Then I decorate the pie a bit, starting with running the end of a butter knife along the edge. Then I gather together all the leftover bits of dough and roll them out flat. Then I take a knife and carve out 3 little apple shapes. And then I take the first one and I place it on the crust and I smush it down a little bit so that it doesn't fall off. Then I cut out a leaf and I place it at the top of the apple. And then I cut out another one for the other side. And then I cut out a little stem and place it down on top. And then I take a knife and carve some veins into the leaves for detail. And then I repeat the process for the other 2 apples. And this totally isn't necessary when making this pie. It's just something that I've done since I was a kid, so I like doing it. This is something you need to do, though, which is cut some slashes in the top so that the steam can escape. Then I do another layer of pink on the highlights because the red kind of drowned it out. Then I mix together a neutral tint, which is black mixed with water, and I start by using that on the background. I want it to be more of a gray than a purplish blue tone. Then I make dark red with carmine, scarlet, cadmium orange, and this Madder Lake red to make it kind of bloody. Then I use that in a few spots on the peel that are in shadow to give it some more 3-dimensionality. Then this part on the body of the apple where the peeled off peel is reflecting onto it. Then I use it on this spot that's under the shadow of the peeling off peel on the left side. Preheat the oven to 425, then put little bits of butter on top of the crust. And this recipe's vegan till now, so if you want a vegan pie, you can omit that. Then put it in the oven at 425 for 10 minutes. Then I take the main red peel color and do another layer of that to help blend in the dark red areas. And for me, the more layers, the better when it comes to watercolor. It's got a level of transparency to it. It lets each layer show through a little bit, adding more texture and character each time. Then I use the main red on the apple body, covering the dark parts too so they blend in. And then I do the red at the top by the stem again. Now I'm doing a final layer of yellow apple flesh. It was getting a little washed out by all the bright red, so I wanted to pump up the vibrancy on it a bit. Then I do the same for the golden parts of the apple peel. And then the yellow-green parts on the peel near the stem. And finally another layer of pink on the peel's highlights. After 10 minutes, turn the heat down to 350 for 30 to 35 minutes and keep watching the crust. When it's getting brown, I take the pie out of the oven and cover the crust with aluminum foil so that it doesn't get burnt. Now I'm done with color and I'm going to use the neutral tint to shade sections so that the dark parts are actually darker, not just more vibrant. And I start with the dark parts of the background, the shadows under the apple and the peel and in the foreground here. Then I use the neutral tint on the flesh of the apple, adding a bit more dimension to it with the shading I'm doing. And I do a little layering to make a darker spot under the shadow of the peel once the first layer has dried. Then I tint the peel on the body of the apple, which is all in shadow, so it's pretty simple. Then the part up by the stem. And then I do the rest of the peel. And with this layer, I'm tinting everywhere on the painting except for the highlights where the light is directly hitting, which is those pink spots in the light yellow flesh section at the top of the apple. So I cover everything up except those spots, and I put some individual brush strokes along the edge of the highlight where the light starts to fade out. Once the time is up, I take the pie out of the oven, and as you can see, some of the foil fell off, so part of the crust is burnt in one spot. Then I do another layer of neutral tint, this time only doing parts that are a bit more in shadow than the baseline, adding some more three-dimensionality in the process. And going over those dark red sections and deepening them and blending them more. Then I do another round of the shadow under the apple, and then another layer of neutral tint on the body of the apple, using a bit of wet on wet technique to mix up the texture a bit, as well as some individual brush strokes. Then I do another layer of all over neutral tint on the peeling off part of the peel, everywhere except the very lightest highlights at the end of the peel. Then I do a few more layers of the shadow underneath the apple, overlapping them so that it's nice and dark. And then another layer of the neutral tint on the body of the apple. Then another layer of the shadow, and as I said, the more layers the better because it makes it more interesting texturally. And then I do one final layer using the neutral tint on the peel of the apple, and this time I'm only doing the dark spots. And it gives it a little bit more three-dimensionality, as I said. So I let the pie sit for a bit to cool before serving, but it's really good served warm with vanilla ice cream, so I don't wait too long. And because I didn't wait, the slice is kind of a mess when I serve it. Once it cools down, it holds its shape together much better, and this doesn't look as good, but it tastes amazing. And then finally, I sign the painting, making sure all the paint underneath has dried first, so there's no bleeding on these little letters. And then here's a time lapse of the whole painting from start to finish. And there's the final finished painting. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to check out my other videos. Bye!